Today's guest is Michael Grunwald, who is a best-selling author who is recently publishing a new book, We're Eating the Earth. And Mike, apparently you've written two books before that. That's amazing. You're also a staff writer with the Washington Post, Time Magazine, and Politico Magazine, and you've won several awards. And I've spoken to you a few times, and it's always been really just great and fascinating. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Shelley.
So my little intro, and then I do want to dive into the book. And you can maybe thank you for giving me a preview because I've read it and I thought it was great. And what I thought was really great about it is there always seem to be two opinions about ag, climate, whatever. There's the climate people that are all about regenerative and no chemicals, and maybe farming like they used to do in the indigenous times, where everything was great. And then there's the other side of the maybe traditional industry that is in self-preservation. Don't look here, don't ask questions. Everything's good. We're having more babies, we got to feed them. And you seem to be kind of in the middle where you understand that we need industrial agriculture and intensive farming, but you also have some issues with the system that you think could be better. So maybe we'll set it there. And if you can start by telling us a little bit about the book and then talk about some of the things that you think we can do better.
Sure. I think you're right. I think food and agriculture has become very ideological, not necessarily partisan in the American sense, where you have the right wing and the left wing. Actually, you
A
have,
little bit
you
of
know,
that too.
well, but it's actually, on, this sort of team regenerative that you talk about, right? You've got the sort of Joe Rogan and Bobby Kennedy on the right, but
Right.
you've also
The
got Al
culture.
Gore and, Michael Pollan on the left. And then, yes, you have this kind of team industrial as well. I tried to be sort of less ideological than kind of mathematical and logical, uh, because I do think, look, first of all, I think an extraordinarily large percentage of the country and the world doesn't even think about these issues. I know I didn't, and I've been a policy reporter for 30 years. I've been a climate reporter on and off for 15 years, but I just knew about energy, and I realized I didn't know anything about the food part of the problem, and that's really a third of the climate problem.
Wait, so
Not-
that's interesting. So how did you stumble upon it? When and how?
It's a crazy, I tell the story in my introduction, but I was writing a story about my own green life, how I'd put solar panels on my roof and I'd gotten an electric car, and I wrote
You did
about
your
sort
part.
of right. And so my idea was that to write, I was not some eco saint. I just was doing it because I realized that I could make money, I could save money, and that to me suggested that this stuff was kind of ready for the mainstream. So I had a line in there about how, I don't unplug my computer at night, I don't line dry my laundry, I still eat meat. And then when I look back at that line, I realized I honestly don't know if meat is bad for the climate. I know everybody kind of says it is, but I called this guy I knew who is an expert on agriculture and climate, and I said, "Hey, Tim, is meat really so bad for the climate?" And he said, "Yes." And then he said, "Duh." and and that was sort of the beginning of my journey where I realized that if I was so spectacularly ignorant about this stuff,
Yeah.
then probably most people are. Not in your world, Shelley,
No,
but
I
it
was
was
completely
shocking to
ignorant
me.
as well when I got started. And as I got educated, I also thought, my God, I'm raising kids that are completely ignorant.
Yeah,
Because how could they know anything? They walk into a supermarket and everything's just there in abundance, right? And they almost never
right.
see a farm.
Right.
And
You
when they
think it
do,
grows
it
on,
looks like something from the movies.
you think it grows on shelves. I had written a lot about urban sprawl, right? This idea that our cities and suburbs are kind of like moving into nature. But, all of those, you know, are developed areas, our highways and driveways and, houses and schools. That's like 1% of the Earth's land. And
Hmm.
agriculture, our farms and pastures, are 40%. Two of every 5 acres of this planet are now being either cropped or grazed. And so that's the idea that we are eating the earth, but it's really agriculture that's eating the earth. And I think for a lot of us, it's kind of flyover country. It's something that we only, maybe we'll occasionally hike through a forest, or we'll, when we literally take a cross country flight, we see all those squares and circles and kind of say like, huh, there are a lot of farms out there. But I don't think people have really, incorporated this idea that, we vote on our diet 3 times a day and that it has an incredible impact on this planet. That was the kind of story I wanted to tell. It was this idea that we have a third of the climate problem and a much larger percentage of our biodiversity problems and water shortages and water pollution problems was, basically created by our food, but it's only 3% of climate finance. It's like, 1% of climate conversation, and nobody is grappling with these issues. My book kind of tries to grapple.
So let's talk about, I guess, one, tell me about the protagonist in the book and how this actually goes, how he flows.
Well, it's that guy who I first called, Tim Searchinger,
Him. Okay.
who I had
He's a
known
real
for
guy.
25 years. And I knew him as this brilliant, you know, slightly obnoxious, obsessive, relentless, um, does the reading, does the work, and expects everybody else to do it thinker. But when I knew him, he was just a wetlands lawyer. And then by the time I had called him, sort of unbeknownst to me, he had become essentially a quasi-scientist. He's now published 10 published articles in Science or Nature. And even though he doesn't have a
He
scientific
doesn't have a
degree,
PhD. Wow.
but he is really, it turns out one of the world's leading experts on the intersection of food, agriculture, and climate. And the reason I used him, and the narrative takes a kind of unusual path, right? Because it starts out with his intellectual journey, which began with biofuels, where
Hmm.
he realizes essentially that biofuels, which were seen at the time as this fantastic climate solution, were actually a climate disaster. And the reason was that they used too much land, and that the climate analysis was simply ignoring
Right.
the land. It was treating
Yeah.
land as if it was free. And sort of long story short is he publishes in Science. He kind of shows the world that, corn ethanol and soy biodiesel are actually terrible for the climate. And the reason is because they are creating, basically when you grow corn and you use it for fuel instead of food, then somewhere else you need to grow more corn for food. And that's going to
Right.
be not in a parking lot. It's going to be in a forest or a wetland. But the bottom line is that we are now using about a Texas worth of the planet for biofuels, but we are using 75 Texas's worth of the planet for agriculture. And so that is really kind of Tim's journey. And he was the guy banging his spoon on his high chair saying like, hey, land use matters. Every acre is sacred, and we are treating it as if it were free. But there is an opportunity cost when we
Right.
use land. We use it land to grow fuel. We can't use it to grow food. We can't use it to store carbon. And we are going to need our land to produce a lot more food and do it with a lot fewer emissions.
So I think you talk on this topic because I was going to touch on biofuels, but now I'm thinking even beyond the biofuels, the accounting system.
Mhm.
And you talk about the fact that we didn't always have accounting, right?
Still don't.
Not for climate, in general.
Oh, yeah.
Right, that I thought that was really clever that we feel like the world that we're in is just so well developed. And then the more I read a lot of history and just fascinates me to see really the last 200 years, just the development that we've gone through. So accounting, gap accounting that we take for granted has only been around for whatever, 100 years or so. And we couldn't run business today without it. Yet we don't really have climate accounting. And honestly, I don't know. I bang my head in the wall. I have no idea how one would, because it's not, it's very complicated. How do you track this? It's a global system. You can't fragment it, just that won't work. So how do you can't improve something you can't measure. So first, how do you measure it? And make sure that everyone measures it the same way.
Well, look, it's a little complicated. Look,
A
and
little bit.
I don't tell people how important accounting is to my book because it makes it sound like, the most boring book ever written. And I tried to make it a
Sorry,
fun
sorry. I thought that
narrative.
was super clever though, because I
But
think this is the
like,
fundamental problem
what
of it all. If the environment is free,
right,
then we're doing
exactly.
everything the right way.
Right. Well, one of Tim's lines is that if you want to do a bad thing, go do a bad thing. And if you want the whole world to do bad things, then set up accounting rules that incentivize people to do bad things. And
Yeah,
that is really, that's the story of our financial crisis
yeah,
of 2008. And that is the story of a lot of our climate accounting today, which, and the long story short is that it treats land as if it were free when all land has a cost. And as, Mark Twain said, they're not making any more of it. And so, it will be difficult to have better climate accounting, but essentially it involves treating land as if it has, trying to put a value on it so that if you're using it, the cost is reflected in that. And that is true for solar panels as well as it is for biofuels. The fact, though, is that, solar panels produce about 100 times as much energy per acre as biofuels. So the accounting works a lot better for solar
yeah,
panels. And so this is just, and this leads, when we talk about the larger food and agriculture problems, a lot of the excitement about some of this kind of low yield, kinder and gentler, more natural farming is this idea that, oh, well, if you look at the acre where I'm farming, it's I'm being nicer to the environment. I'm not using as many chemicals. Maybe I have a little bit more biodiversity in the microbiome. But the fact is that if you're producing less food on that acre, then you are going to need more acres to produce food. And you are
right.
going to end up tearing down, natural acres that are much more diverse than your farm. Michael Pollan, who's a beautiful writer, but he's created this notion that there are these kind of all natural farms that are good, that are
Right.
bucolic, that are pastoral, that are diverse, and that the real environmental crime was transforming them into these industrial farms that are monocultures and they're drenched in chemicals and they have fertilizer that ends up in the Gulf of Mexico. And all of these, there is an environmental cost, no doubt about it. And one of the things I push for is that, we need to make more food with less land and also less mess. But the fact is, the real environmental crime, the real disaster was the transformation of nature into those nice Michael Pollan bucolic farms. That's where you really lose the biodiversity. That's where you
You
lose
just
the
couldn't live
carbon
there.
storage. And
Yeah.
so that's where, this idea that we are eating the earth is this, I'm trying to wave my hands in the air and say, like, hey, farming makes a mess. We should try to make less of a mess. But the most important thing we need to do is have it take up less space,
Yeah.
so that we can have more space for nature.
Okay, so there's two things I can do. One is I can ask you questions where I know the answer. And that would probably be better, but that's not what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna ask you a question where I don't know the answer and
All
let's see
right.
where it goes. Um, Absolutely, right. My perspective as well is that farming is extractive. The point is we grow food because we want to eat and we just need to live with that and relax, right? I'm sorry, but that's just the way it is. Um, but here's the thing. So with our technology, I can always walk the higher ground because we kind of have a win-win-win, right? We have something that farmers want that's better for the plants, better for the soil. You want to optimize your operations, grow more with less and all that. And then the question that I tend to get is if you really walk this through, okay, so we grow more per acre, the cost of or the price of commodity crops drops, and now you have more demand, so now you're growing more. And if you walk through that cycle, which is the problem I was going to bring up, it actually made me think about what you're talking about, which is the opposite. If regenerative actually makes it more expensive to grow food, well, maybe it's actually going to create less demand. So how does one work through this continuous incentive system and just maybe infinite demand? I don't know if that's a thing, but
This is a great question. So the first thing I would say is that there it's absolutely true. Essentially, I'm making a case for high yield agriculture. And one thing I would point out is that I'm not the guy saying like industrial agriculture is great. I mean, in the past, one thing about factory farms, like factories, they're really good at manufacturing a lot of stuff. So great. But if regenerative and organic can create high yields, and I write in my book about some areas where regenerative practices, particularly on the grazing side, are contributing to really high
Mhm.
yields, that's awesome. So I'm all for that. But it is true that so globally, we need high yields so that we can have more food, and ultimately that will mean less land because, demand is what it is.
You
That
think that
said,
demand will,
that said, I mean, people aren't going to eat more than they eat. But that said, it is absolutely true that if you help a farmer in Brazil increase his yields, the first thing he is going to want to do is cut down more trees to expand his fields and make more money. Which is why I call it this kind of wicked problem. It's a little bit of the rebound effect they talk of in economics. But if you're going to look, it would be great if we got to this sort of perspective where yields were so high and international governance was so good that we could actually talk about this kind of thing. But I do think the answer ultimately is a kind of combination of produce and protect, where it's tied together, where we're helping farmers essentially increase their yields, and we're helping them with the technologies that can help them make less of a mess, whether it's stuff like interplant or it's, biopesticides or biofertilizers or drought tolerant crops, you name it. That's the sort of thing that government can help with investment and can get it to the farmers, but it needs to be tied to a kind of nationwide or at least a very large jurisdictional commitment against deforestation, against wetland destruction, and essentially the money gets cut off if the trees come down.
right?
That's the immediate response is, but that would be really hard. And my answer is yes. Pretty much
Yeah.
everything I talk about is really hard. It's going to be really hard to get people to eat less beef. It's going to be really hard to get people to waste less food. It's going to be
Yeah.
really hard to get, better, sustainable intensification in the developing world. All of this stuff is hard, and we're going to need to do all the things, but it's not a reason not to do it.
Yeah, it's funny because the technology is actually the easy part. It really
Yeah,
is, you know? And
and
when you
it's what
click
we're
on
good
it,
at, right?
yeah, that's what we're good at. And
Right,
there's
as a
usually a
species,
win-win. Yeah.
right?
And then
I
you
mean,
have global policy,
yeah.
which
I mean,
is
I
very
got this thing in
challenging.
my pocket that I can chat with anybody anywhere on the planet. I can look up any fact known to mankind, and I can use it as a flashlight, right? I mean, a few
Yeah.
years ago, everybody would have said that was
Or
crazy,
calculator. Remember
right?
those?
Yeah,
Yeah.
calculator, right? I can take a cool picture, I can take video. Um, Humans are really good at inventing stuff. And I write in the book about a lot of really exciting technological work that's being done on reinventing photosynthesis, on converting, the kind of throwaway crop residues into animal feed, biological nitrification inhibition, which makes me really popular at parties. But look, I mean, there's all kinds of cool stuff happening. What we're not so good at is, changing our behavior because we think it'll be good for the planet. Being nice to each other. Those are sorts of things that humans have not been great at unless we've perceived an immediate threat. And climate change is invisible. It's slow moving. It's not the kind, it's in some ways it's kind of kryptonite for the way we're this kind of like short term,
Mhm.
now focused, kind of me species.
Yeah. But it's funny, I get the question a lot about, so what's going to happen? And my answer usually is when the crisis comes, we're going to be able to mobilize really well because that's what we know how to do as people. And it's the only time where we get together. And then I think the solutions are there. But it's
Yeah,
hard
except it's
because
a
none of
weird
these
kind of
things are
crisis
one.
though, right?
What?
Um, I mean, I agree with you, except it's a weird kind of crisis, right? I
No,
mean,
it's
like,
got to be a large scale. Don't tell me there are already weather events everywhere. I know that, but it's not it's not simmering the frog and eventually it's boiled. It's like something's gonna happen. It's gonna be COVID, and then everyone's gonna wake up and say it's COVID. So we're gonna be active for 2 years. We're gonna learn some things.
we'll see. I mean, I don't know if climate change works like that, and I don't know if biodiversity loss or pollution works like that. You know, it is true. Look, like California already had its apocalypse, right? It's like
True,
it got wiped
true.
out by
But
a
it's got to be a global
climate-driven
one.
wildfire.
This is a global problem. It needs to be a
And
global crisis.
right, but it's not, right? It's just going to be, it is a little bit. We are the frogs in the pot.
We
I
are
think
definitely the
that's
frogs in a pot.
you
Yeah.
know, I think that's true. And this is one reason where I kind of, you know, one of the big themes of the book is that better is better than worse, right? It looks like,
Right.
you know,
Yeah.
we're not going to hit 1.5 degrees, but like 1.6 would be way better than 1.7, and
Yeah. That
1.65 would be better than 1.7. And so look, if, you know, perfect isn't on the menu, but I do think like that's why all of these different solutions being pursued, you know, by all these different really smart people like you, that are all going to kind of whittle away at the problem. I think that's, you know, I don't have a better answer than that
Yeah,
because
yeah. Wait, let's talk about that actually,
yeah,
because that was going to be one of my questions around better is better than worse. I don't know. It doesn't flow so much, but
true
um,
though.
that one of the issues is that everyone is so intense in their own side, right? So we have this ideological problem, which is what you talked about in the beginning, and it is so entrenched that no one can just have a conversation about something that's not 100%. No chemical, all chemical. That one specifically is the one that drives me crazy because it's happening right now. It's unraveling, right? So for people that listen to this probably talk about soy and corn a lot. And this has been one of the things that I find so confusing because the right conversation about glyphosate is not don't use any or use as much as you can, which are the conversations we're having. The right conversation is how do we use it the most optimized way possible, which is the thing. Like you can do that right now and reduce a huge percentage of it, but still keep the tool so you don't traumatize people.
I
But
think that's
somehow ideology gets in the way of having a very kind of basic argument.
and facts, right? I mean, I try to traffic in facts. And look, I mean, you know, you can find a lot of, I mean, glyphosate is, I think, you know, not really one of the worst ones, but you can find a lot of chemicals that have had a lot of damage, whether it's, you know, in terms of air pollution or water pollution. It's true, like, you know, synthetic fertilizers, which have probably saved billions of lives, and it's
The
the reason
most
half of
lives in
us are here.
history.
But
Yeah.
they're also
After
creating
vaccines,
a
actually, the second. No,
right,
wait,
but
what
they're
was the
also
number one? I
creating
can't remember.
this incredible dead zone the size of Connecticut in the Gulf of Mexico. They're, you know, algal blooms in the Great Lakes. So I think you have to kind of acknowledge that some of these chemicals do make a mess, but also fertilizers help stuff grow. And pesticides are really good at killing pests. And you know, we need to, you know, and again, since I keep coming back to the math, we're going to need to produce 50% more calories by 2050. Probably, you know, we're on track to need 70% more meat. We're going to have to do it with no more land and about 80% fewer emissions. So that's a problem.
But like that just sounds like fear mongering again, right? Like everyone says that. That is like the number one sentence is we're gonna have to feed more people. We're gonna have to feed more people. How do you get them to have that conversation that maybe is not 100% aligned with their ideology, but is better than worse is better?
Well, I think, you know, what I try to do, look, I hear a lot of, you know, oh, we don't need more food. We just need to stop eating beef.
Yeah, or
Or
have
we don't
less
need more
children, which
food.
seems to be the trajectory.
We just need to stop wasting food.
Yeah,
We just need to
right.
distribute it better. And this
Yeah.
is where I keep going back to the math, which is let's imagine that in the rich world, we actually did reduce our beef consumption in half. And beef is the baddie. That's like, it's like 10 times
Yeah. Yeah,
worse
yeah.
than
What happens
chicken.
then?
And then, but then let's also imagine that the entire world cut food waste in half, which again, this is like pretty ambitious, right? And then, you know, I don't like my biofuels, right? That's taking up land. Imagine we got rid of that entirely.
Hmm.
Well, the math still sucks. You're still going to need to make more food with less land. The math won't be as bad as if we don't change our dietary habits or our food
Yeah.
ways. But we are really are going to have to do all the things. And again, I'm not, that's, I can't, I try to keep reminding people that I came into this cold. It's not like I had some, idea that like there is no silver bullet. I don't know. Maybe there was a silver bullet. It wasn't like I was like, oh, the vegans are crazy. Like, I don't know. Let's see. Can we, they've been yelling at people that meat is murder and, educating people for a long time. But it looks like meat consumption continues to increase every year. So again, I didn't come at this with not just an ideology, but with a bias. I came at this with like, let's figure out what the hell's going on and what the problem is and what the potential solutions are. And what I found is a lot of really exciting, promising solutions that unfortunately have gotten just about no traction anywhere so far. Um,
Yeah.
so, so that's why I'm kind of waving my hands in the air and saying like, we got to start doing, if not all the things, because I do write about a couple solutions that don't work, but we got to do almost all the things. We got to do a lot of things.
And what about, so specifically meat? One of the things that does come up in all conversations in our circles is you gotta consume less meat, especially beef, or the whole thing doesn't work. So is that true? Is that really the one problem that's gonna kill us,
Well, it's a
specifically?
problem. It's a really big problem. I mean, 3/4 of our agricultural land is used to raise livestock. And like in the United States, beef provides about 3% of our calories and it's 50% of our land.
Yeah.
It is really, beef is the baddie. Beef is what's tearing down the Amazon. I like to say that when you bite into a burger, you're not just eating a cow, you're eating a jaguar and a macaw and the rest of the cast of Rio, right? I mean, it's
That's a new one.
it really is a problem. And look, I'm excited, even though I have a couple chapters about the rise and fall of the kind of so-called fake meat, the
Oh
plant-based
yeah, yeah.
meat, mycelium-based meat, and even the cultivated meat made from animal cells. And they were incredibly popular. I started my reporting at the Good Food Institute conference in 2019, where everybody was
The
talking
peak.
about is it going to take
Yeah.
10 years or 15 years to get rid of meat? And I thought I was going to accidentally raise the Series A round on the drinks line. I mean, it was just insane exuberance. I went back when I was finishing reporting to GFI in 2023, and it was all doom and gloom. This was a fad. We failed. This is never going to work. I think that's extreme too. And I have a lot of hope that just like, Tesla has provided a better mousetrap, an alternative to fossil fuels. I think that, particularly with some investment and some government help, the way we did with solar and electric vehicles and wind, I think you could see some of these alternative proteins replacing meat. And I do think, even even on the beef side, there's been over the last 50 years, there's been this kind of accidental switch to chicken because
Right.
chicken got cheaper and healthier. And that's
Yeah.
been, the climate would be in much worse shape if that hadn't happened. So I have some faith in that. But then on the other side, and then this, people who liked what I said for the last 2 minutes are going to hate this, but we also need to make beef more efficiently. It's 10 times worse than chicken and pork. What if we
Hmm.
could do it more intensely and more efficiently so that it's only 3 times as bad? That would be a tremendous improvement because, just like Willie Sutton robbed banks because that's where the money was. If you care about emissions, you have to go after beef because that's where the emissions are. And so I
Yeah.
think it's this combination of, you know, on the demand side, trying to change behaviors, maybe public policy. Although I quote that pollster saying that taxes on beef and meat are the worst, least popular policies he's ever polled. He says it's like veterans benefits for ISIS. So, it's gonna be very
But
hard.
there's one more
But
path though, because there seems to me, alternative proteins, cultivated meat, I think is the next one. We're probably done with alternative proteins. Um, that's the American solution to the problem, which is we have a way of being. We don't want to change our way of being. We are perfection. It helps I'm not American, I think. And this is the solution. If the cows are the problem, then we're going to find a way to make the steak without the cow. I think there's probably a better solution, which is the American diet should not be the diet of the world. And there's many, many places, Israel is one of them, but I think so many places where there's less beef consumption, there's healthier diets. And I think we can do it because it's just a matter of if we really acknowledge this, then there's a way to help people decide that they want to eat differently. Like governments have done this all the time. This is what they do. They put out food recommendations and all those triangles and whatnot, and they help people consume. We can
I
do
hope
this.
so. I hope so. And there's like Denmark's a great example where they're working on that, but they're also doing all the things. They're also trying to
Sure.
make their
Absolutely do
dairy
all the
and
things. I
pork
agree.
more
Why
more
not make those
efficient.
cows
They're
better
they're they're
technology anyway?
rewilding. They're rewilding some of their farmland. They're
Mm.
taxing agricultural emissions, and they're trying to promote plant-forward diets. And I think that's great. Look, again, like, our ancestors started eating meat 2 million years ago. It's really delicious. I cut
Mm.
out beef when I started working on this book because I wanted to be a little bit less of a hypocrite.
But
Although, look, I
right,
mean, I think,
you're falling
some,
into this thing again. This is the all or nothing that gets us nowhere.
well, I
We
still
eat
eat chicken
meat.
and pork. I still
No,
eat
meaning
chicken.
like it's I didn't say don't eat meat. What I'm saying is that it's not healthy for anyone to consume beef 3 times a day, which like sometimes we do this here. I'm like, it's wild. I don't even know how much meat I can eat because I don't. And in Israel, the reason we consume less meat is because of kosher rules, right? If you can only
Right.
eat dairy, very simple. No one is doing this and saying, I care about the planet. Forget about the planet. The planet is not the thing. If you can eat
No, it isn't.
healthier because it's good for you, right? That was all of our conversations. Like people do things that serve them. Let's
Well,
forget about this altruistic crap because that's like the 5%. You want to get something done, people need to take care of their health. And maybe there's tastier food, so you don't need to be boggled down by all that processing of beef all day long.
Shelley, you're preaching to the choir with me, and there is a lot of evidence, particularly on red meat, that that's not super healthy. But
It
right now
slows you down too. It's like
the
hard to
culture's
hard to
going the
digest.
opposite way. Like you look on Instagram and there are meatfluencers, and Joe Rogan's talking about his like caveman diet and keto,
We got to
and
get Joe Rogan here to talk about
yeah, and
vegetables
it's
because I'm pretty sure they're good for you.
and this is why I'm like, I think I want people to, to have better diets. I think it's really important and, I support it, but I'm not relying on it because, I just think like I'm not willing to kind of bet the planet on people recognizing what's good for them.
No,
Um,
no,
that,
no. I'm talking
that's
about
again,
advocating
not
so that it
something
becomes
we're
a
awesome at.
government initiative too, because if we do accept the fact that this is a problem we need to solve, right? One of the issues I have with a lot of the climate stuff is that every solution, the people proposing it, they think this is the only solution. So if this doesn't happen, everything's screwed. And it's like, well, this is like your solution to your problem that you selected. And it might be important, it might be not important, but either way, it's not the one thing that's going to save us. But if I think beef might be that one thing where we got to transition to the right direction so the government can get involved, right? Not all or nothing. Beef is
Right,
great, and
right.
and growing cows is great, right? It's just
Right.
like
Well,
finding the right
it needs to be
balance,
better, right? I mean, I
and
think it
it could
has to
be
be a
better.
combination
Yeah,
of
yeah.
less beef and better beef. And of course, as you saw in the book, I think a lot of people think better beef means these like, kind of like organic beef,
No, 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 no,
grass-fed
no,
beef,
no.
but it turns out that's even worse for the
That's
planet.
even worse.
So this
Yeah.
is going to be hard. I mean, the beef industry has a lot of power, not just in the United States, but kind of everywhere there's beef. Um, and and I agree. This needs to be a push, and both on the demand side and the supply side, and both of them will be hard. Though honestly, on the supply side, as I saw in Brazil, they're actually with not that much investment, you can get much more productive beef
Yeah,
ranches, and that's
yeah.
in the interest of the rancher as well. So that I found that kind of one of the more exciting solutions that I actually saw. Um, again,
Which was not high tech. It was
it's
just better
not high tech.
practices.
No,
Yeah.
it's and part of it is like stuff that people don't like feedlots and fertilizing pastures. But part of it is stuff that like Michael Pollan would love, where it's, letting the cows graze cover crops and, rotational grazing and, lots of this good. And again, it's not because they give a shit about the climate. It's not because they read
It's
Michael
just better for
Pollan.
their bottom line.
Sorry.
It's just better for the bottom line.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's just, and these guys are that they're doing it, they're in it for themselves and they're in it to feed the world. And more power to them. As long as there's demand for beef, we need to keep growing it and hopefully growing it with less damage than we've been doing it.
So to wrap up, let me ask you again. I think your perspective is great, and I highly recommend the book because again, it's not the black or white. It's somewhere in the middle. Obviously, you have your own biases, but it does feel very in the middle. And I think that level of education is needed when people are just so entrenched. What I'm curious is how do you get perceived? So when you talk to that Michael Pollan type person, or when you talk to someone who's supporting biofuels, like how does that, what are the objections to your position?
Well, look, the corn ethanol industry once put out a top 10 enemy list, and I was number one. Um,
That's impressive. I
it
forgot
was
that.
actually,
Yeah.
I was kind of proud. The hero of my book, Tim Searchinger, was only number four.
Right. It's
So
kind of
I would,
wild because he's been
kind of give him
fighting the
a,
good fight for a
yeah,
while.
exactly. Shows the power of the media, I guess. Um, but and yeah, and look, I just I think it was right after I saw you last. I did a
Yeah.
debate at Berkeley where I debated a professor of agroecology, and I was kind of making the case that for high yield agriculture, for productive agriculture, and Alice Waters, the famous chef of Chez Panisse, was sitting in the third row, staring daggers at me the whole time. Um, because I think, look, this is right now, it's not cool to look like an apologist for high yield, big ag. I get it. But that said, the head of Newman's Own Organic, Paul Newman's daughter, she came up to me afterwards and was like, "Wow, that was incredible! I learned so much. I think we can kind of learn from each other." The head of Roots for Change, who used to be the chairman of the slow food movement in the entire United States, he just had me on his podcast because he thinks the same kind of thing, that we can kind of bridge some of these divides and both sides can learn from each other. So look, I mean, I do a little bit hide behind this idea that like I genuinely did not have a dog in this hunt when I first got involved. I had
It's
no
been a while.
bias. I just wanted to learn because I knew absolutely nothing. And I've interviewed a couple thousand people, and I've traveled around the world, and I've, talked to people on every side of the issue. And so I think I've learned a lot. And I think the book is, there's a lot of facts in it. Yes, I do say things like, vertical farming, is not going to feed the world. And carbon farming, this idea that we're going to store carbon in our soils, that's going to sort of magically come down from the sky, that's mostly bullshit. Those people are going to be unhappy with me. But I'm happy to discuss the science with them. But I think most people, I think, you know, we want to learn. We want to know more than we did before when we picked up a book, and we want to have a better sort of sense of, like I said, we eat 3 times a day. Um, we don't think very much about where that food comes from. I think for a lot of people, it'll just be interesting. I try to tell the story in a, not in a here's your homework kind of way, but in a like, hey, here's this kind of these cool issues, and here's some cool people working on them. People like you.
Yeah. Well, Mike, thank you so much for being here with us today and I highly recommend the book. When does it come out?
It's July 1st, it drops,
Soon,
but you
soon.
can
We're eating
pre-order it
yours.
already.
Perfect. Thank you so much. This has been a great discussion.
Oh, thanks, Shelley.